my ego. I'm Percy Padrone, and I will be doing I Accidentally Vaporized My Pre-Algebra Teacher from Percy Jackson, written by Rick Riordan. Look, I didn't ask to be a half-blood. Being a half-blood is dangerous. It's scary. Most of the time, it gets you killed in painful, nasty ways. If you're listening to this because you think it's fiction, great, continue on. I envy you for being able to believe none of this ever happened. But if you feel something stirring inside, if you think you find yourself in this speech, leave immediately. Door's right there. Because once you know, they'll know too. And they'll come for you. Don't say I didn't warn you. My name is Percy Jackson. I'm 12 years old, and up until a few months ago, I was a boarding student at Yancey Academy, this private school in upstate New York for troubled kids. Am I a troubled kid? Yeah, you could say that. I could start at any point in my short, miserable life to prove it to you, but things really started going bad last May when my 6th grade class took a field trip to Manhattan to see the Metropolitan Museum of Art to look at ancient Greek and Roman stuff. I know, sounds like torture. Most Yancey field trips were. But Mr. Brunner, our Latin teacher, was leading this field trip, so I had hope. Mr. Brunner was this middle-aged guy in a motorized wheelchair with a big scruffy beard and thinning hair. He didn't seem like he'd be cool, but he told jokes and stories, and he let us play games in class. He was the only teacher who would not put me to sleep. This trip, I was determined to be good. At least, I was determined to not get in trouble. You see, I have this track record when it comes to field trips. Like, in my 5th grade field trip, we went to the Saratoga battlefield, and I had this incident with a Revolutionary War cannon. I wasn't aiming for the school bus, but of course, I got expelled anyway. The entire way into the city, I dealt with Nancy Boba Fett, the freckly, red-headed kleptomaniac girl, hitting my best friend Grover in the back of the head with chunks of peanut butter and ketchup sandwich. And she knew I couldn't do anything back to her because I was already on probation. The headmaster had threatened me with death by in-school suspension if anything bad or embarrassing or mildly interesting happened on this field trip. Mr. Brunner led us through the museum, past big echoey galleries and glass cabinets full of orange and black pottery. It was amazing. This stuff had lasted 3,000 years. He took us to this 13-foot tall stone column with a big old sphinx on top. It was a grave marker for a girl about our age. I was trying to listen to what he had to say because I thought it was genuinely interesting. But everybody around me kept talking, and every time I told them to shut up. Mrs. Dodds, the other teacher chaperone, would give me the evil eye. Mrs. Dodds was this little math teacher from Georgia. She had a leather jacket she wore every day, and she looked mean enough to ride a Harley right into your locker. She joined halfway through the year when our last math teacher had a nervous breakdown. From day 1, Mrs. Dodds absolutely loved little Nancy Boba Fett and figured I was devil spawn. She'd point her crooked finger at me and say, "Now, Percy," real sweet. And I knew I was gonna get after-school detention for a month. One time, she made me erase answers out of old math workbooks until midnight. continued to talk about Greek funeral art, and then we all went to lunch. We sat on the very front steps of the museum so we could watch the foot traffic. And just as I was unwrapping my sandwich, Nancy Bulbafit and her ugly friends strolled up, and she poured her half-eaten lunch in Grover's lap. I tried to stay calm. My guidance counselor told me 1,000,000 times, count to 10, take control of your temper. But I was so mad! It's like a wave roared in my ears. I do not remember touching her. But the next thing I knew, Nancy was on her butt in a fountain, absolutely soaked, screaming, "Percy pushed me!" Mrs. Dodds materialized next to us. "Now, Percy!" I know! I grumbled at her. A month erasing workbooks. That was not the right thing to say to her, apparently. I turned to face Mrs. Dodds, but she wasn't there anymore. She was at the top of the museum steps, like way up there. How did she get there so fast? My brain does that sometimes. It's like it falls asleep and I've missed something, like something important. Guidance counselor says it's my ADHD. So I followed Mrs. Dodds. We walked back into the museum and she stood in front of this huge marble frieze of the Greek gods, arms crossed with this growling noise. It sounded like She turned to me and she said, "I know what you've done." And I thought, oh shoot. The teachers found the illegal stash of candy I'd been selling out of my dorm room all semester. She looked to me and she said, "Your time's up, Percy Jackson." And her leather jacket stretched into these huge bat wings. Her hands turned into these talons. Her eyes glowed like they were barbecue coals. She was not human. She was a shriveled hag, and she was about to slice me into ribbons. But then, things got even stranger. Mr. Brunner, who had just been in front of the museum, wheeled into the entryway with a pen in his hand. Mrs. Dodds lunged at me, and I felt the air whisk by my ear. I caught the pen in my hand, but it wasn't a pen anymore. It was a sword, a bronze sword. I swung at Mrs. Dodds, hit her right in the shoulder, slipped right through her, like she was made of water. It was like seeing a sandcastle in a power fan. She exploded with this shrill, hiss. It was like, she vaporized on the spot, exploded. And then I was alone. No Mrs. Dodds, clearly. No Mr. Brunner, just me and a pen. So I went back outside. I went down the front steps of the museum and saw Nancy Dodd and her ugly friends grumbling. And she turned, faced me, and said, "I hope Mrs. Care whipped your butt." Who's Mrs. Care? We have never had a Mrs. Care. So I went to go ask Mr. Brunner. I said, "Hey, where's Mrs. Dodds, the other teacher's chaperone?" He looked at me. He leaned forward in his wheelchair and said, real concerned, "Percy, there's never been a Mrs. Dodds on this trip. I don't think there's ever been a Mrs. Dodds at Yancey Academy." Now, I was used to the occasional weird experience, but this was a 24/7 hallucination, and so much more than I could handle. Every now and then, I would spring a Mrs. Dodds reference on somebody just to see if I could trip them up. But they would always look at me like I was this psycho. Something happened at the museum. I know it. Gradually, my grades started slipping from D's to F's. I started getting into more fights with Nancy Boba Fett and her ugly friends! And then, the following week, it was made official. I would not be welcomed back to Yancey Academy next semester.